effect.
Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Varendes, and today we have a great episode. I definitely was a little mentally and physically tired for this show, but luckily I have great news. I have two of the smartest, most delightful people to talk to, James Corbett of the Corbett Report and Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com. And it was an amazing conversation. It's super fun to have these connections and to meet all these people in this whole journey of creating the Ripple Effect podcast. And I asked Richard Grove to come on the show to co-host with me because James just came out with a new documentary called Why Big Oil Conquered the World, which is the sequel to How Big Oil Conquered the World. And Richard Grove was in the documentary. So coincidentally, we were talking recently and I swung by his house in Connecticut for his birthday and asked him if he wanted to come on and co-host because I figured he could obviously add to the conversation because he knew a lot about the topics, and that's why he was in James's documentary in the first place. So it was a really fun conversation. We had a blast talking. It was cool because we all agreed and disagreed on different things, and I think that's what makes for a really fun conversation. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. Hopefully I don't sound too dumb next to James and Rich, who are always so well-spoken and have their thoughts gathered and thought out much better than I ever do. So, but it's one of those conversations and one of those podcasts that I truly believe in the process of it and after it, you always end up learning something and kind of growing with these type of conversations. So I think it's very important to be able, and like I say on the podcast, it's very important to be able to share your ideas, but also be willing to have those ideas and perspectives challenged. And I keep stressing that because I think that's much more important than just already having an established idea that you want to share with people. I think being able to let your ideas be challenged, and if you go down that road of letting your ideas be challenged and you end up in the same location, you end up at the same place, then you're probably at the right place to begin with. So thanks again, guys. This was a video episode. James did call in. Unfortunately, Rich didn't have access to video, but if you go on our YouTube channel, RV Theory 6, or just search the Ripple Effect Podcast, you'll be able to find the video version of all our episodes, and anybody calling in using video like James did on this podcast and many podcasts before when he was previously on, you'll be able to see me and James actually visually have the conversation. So if you want to see our ugly mugs, well, I'll speak for myself. James is a good-looking lad. But if you want to see us, then go on our YouTube channel, subscribe, and check that out. And also in the show notes, I always put links to all our guests' websites, social media sites, and all that stuff. So I'll have links also to James's new documentary. I'm going to fuck him up. Why Big Oil Conquered the World, not how. Why. Why Big Oil Conquered the World is the second one. That's the new one that just recently was released. And How Big Oil Conquered the World is his previous documentary, which I have had him on to talk about. So if you go in our archives, just search Ripple Effect Podcast, James Corbett, you'll see the episode where I have him on to talk about all the topics and subjects that he talks about in that documentary. So check them out. They're free on YouTube, free on his website, thecorbettreport.com. So please check it out. Also, thank you so much for the Patreon members, subscribers. I did this last time. I'm not sure what to call them. Contributors. That's the word. Thanks a lot, Patreon contributors, anybody who also buys Theory 6 music to help support the show. And most importantly, anybody who has uploaded this to their channel, these conversations to their channel or their website, or shared it or tweeted it or any of that stuff. I really appreciate it. It's to me, it's much more important to kind of just share these conversations. And if you think this podcast or any past podcast is worth sharing, please do so. And also rate the podcast on iTunes and all that stuff. So I think that's it for now. We have a bunch of great shows coming up, so keep a lookout, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace. What's up, buddy?
Not much. How you doing?
Not bad. A little late, but not too bad. I can always count on you to be, roughly around the same time. We talked about this on the last time you're on.
It's getting worse and worse. You used to say I was punctual as a clock, and now I'm roughly around the time.
When you have kids and you have a family.
It's exactly right.
And it's
you know it is.
And Richard's with us. I don't know if you got my last email. He's joining us with this conversation. Richard Grove, you're our buddy from your new film.
Indeed. Well, I didn't see your new email, but hey, Richard, how you doing?
How you doing, James? Yeah, Ricky was over here the other night with his family, and we were having a little party, and he said, hey, I'm doing an interview with James on Monday. And I said, well, that's the day before my birthday, so I'll consider that a present to sit in.
It's a present to me.
I thought it was a present to me because I didn't have to prepare. I could just participate in the conversation. I said, yeah, I could do that. It was very nice of Ricky to offer.
Well, and, I love having, there is something about only two people speaking, because I think that sometimes you kind of focus on one another, but there's something about having a third person in too, that it just sometimes we'll be thinking something and then you'll just come up with a question.
Yeah, I'm the wild card.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nice. When I used to do the show with my co-host, that's what I used to love about having him on. And he's always like, oh, but I don't know too much about the topic, or I don't know, and I'm like, well, I don't either, but you might know a little less. But
that's even better, because then they get to play the audience position and voice what the audience is thinking. Yeah, right.
Well, that's actually some of my issues sometimes. I feel like if I have somebody on, like people that I have on, usually people that I'm really familiar with the work, and I love them for their work and their documentaries, music, whatever it may be. And I'm so familiar with it that sometimes I feel like there's questions that the listener will probably be saying, Ricky, ask that fucking question. But I already know the answer.
Yeah, Ricky, part of your job is to broker that understanding, that communication that goes on,
Yeah, well,
so,
I guess my goal
learn from James, man.
I guess my goal is to make it not feel like a job at all. So because I really enjoy this. So I feel fake when I'm asking a question I already know the answer to, but I know sometimes it just
say for the benefit of the folks at home.
Yeah, no, you're right. I should ask some of those, but it's hard because it's like, well, that's an obvious answer. I already, but it's
it's not cliche if it works to communicate, right? So that's something you've probably heard on TV before, right? Yeah. You could also say, now this.
Yeah, but as James knows, this conversation goes off the rails quite commonly. Like, if
Does
I had
he take it off the rails, or do you, Ricky?
That's a good question. Usually,
it's conversation. It's just conversation.
Exactly. I mean,
but our last conversation was, I think, on a very different topic. So that's why it was so wide ranging, huh?
Yeah. That we I don't know if you heard it, Rich, but I'll send it to you. It was a great conversation. It was funny how it all came about too.
What was it about? See how I did that? People at home are like, what are they? What was it? I missed it. So what was it about?
Well. It was with a musician, Vinny, who you got to listen to it because it's a long story, and I feel like we're gonna end up.
You sold me on it.
I sold you on it already. Look at that! I just.
Ricky's the closer.
But I wanted to have one reason was I was at Rich's house this past weekend, and then I was thinking, I'm like, Rich knows a lot about this topic or the topics in this documentary, because obviously he was in it, and. I'm like, hey, co-host, and if you want to be on, it'd be great because you are in the documentary. And I think this documentary is super important because it kind of does talk about the big picture. And you have been on, James, in the past to talk about the first part of this documentary, which was why or how big oil conquered the world, and this one's why big oil conquered the world, which is really, it's not like you say in the documentary, it's really not about oil at all. And, it's eugenics, it's, you talk about climate change, you talk about all these, you break it up in 3 parts. And I think it's super important for people to see the big picture, because I think sometimes we get caught up in these specifics and we lose what the big scheme of it is. It really, like you said, it's not really about oil in the first place. And eugenics is something that's really interesting because I think it's a topic that, it's interesting because it goes into racism. It goes into, back in the day when they thought Italians and Irish and African Americans were less than these other people. It was genetically proven that they were dumber and less capable than, certain Europeans. And it's funny because there's peer-reviewed studies that they had. I mean, scientists were actually saying this. It wasn't just, Alex Jones, just screaming this stuff. It was actually scientists, and this was kind of common knowledge to people. But so to give people an overview on what your new documentary is about, if you had to break it down to kind of give somebody who's like, okay, well, why Big Oil conquered the world? What's that about? Because the first one was obvious. It was about the history of Big Oil and how it became Big Oil and all that stuff, and how they got us dependent on their product that they controlled. But this one isn't about that. It's not probably not as simple to kind of break down, but could you just kind of give an overview?
Yeah. Well, okay. So again, for the benefit of the audience, I think if people hear just the title of this, How Big Oil Conquered the World, Why Big Oil Conquered the World, they probably already have the answers there in their head. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And maybe they would start around the same place that I start in How Big Oil Conquered the World, with the Rockefeller clan and how Standard Oil came together. And then there's a little bit about Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which became BP, and Royal Dutch Shell, and how that came together. So that part of the story all seems to make sense. And then how that leads into resource wars of the 20th century, and then then people would probably be thinking along those lines. But I think, yes, this documentary takes a very different direction with this, because as you say, fundamentally, this isn't about oil, it's about control. And oil was a very, very convenient way for these families, these connected oligarchs, as I call them, to gain control over vast swaths of the human population. Because, of course, energy is the fundamental resource of the world. It is it's the lifeblood of the economy. And if you can control that, if you can monopolize the key energy resource that people use, then you have unbelievable amounts of control. So I think that we touched on that in How Big Oil, or it gave a fairly big overview of how the oil families then used their oil wealth and power to take over education, take over medicine, take over industry, agriculture, the food supply, all of these other things. So that, I think, took it in a direction that would have been surprising to some of the people who had their ideas about big oil. But why big oil really fleshes out, I think, as you say, the bigger picture of where. So what is this about? Where did it come from? Where is it going? And it ties back in those three parts, as you say, to the eugenics philosophy, the idea that there are certain groups, certain families, certain family lines that are genetically superior to the rest of us and thus deserve to rule over us. And then that idea, obviously not flying very well with the general public, morphed through a process that's called crypto-eugenics into conservation, environmentalism, overpopulation concerns, climate change, these sorts of issues, which a lot of people had concerns about in the mid-20th century, were shaped by institutions founded and formed by the very same eugenics and oil-backed interests that were behind the eugenics movement. Isn't that interesting? And then that is starting to morph into this technological control grid called Technocracy. Technocracy was the name of this movement that formed in the 1930s, really, but is still with us today and becoming more prevalent as the technocratic idea of a world where everything is surveilled and controlled and tracked and databased and logged goes from being a wild, crazy-eyed fantasy, 100 years ago, to self-evident reality today. I mean, it's happening, and the only question is, who's in control of this? So that's the big picture of what I'm trying to paint. And as I say, I think it does take it way outside of the bounds of what most people would think when they hear that. And that's important because one of the biggest tricks that the oligarchs have played is to make people think that it's all about oil, we care about oil. We're moving away from oil now. So, yay, it's all about the earth and the environment and helping and saving people now. So you can all get behind this new movement that we're creating, that we backed, that we funded, that we control the major international organizations for our own benefit, secretly, or not so secretly, really, but it's just no one really bothers to look into that. And that's the trick that they're playing. And that's why this is, I think, an exceptionally important documentary series for people in that mindset to see. People who think that they know the story of big oil and, we're fighting against the oligarchs by, going with the UN and United Nations Environment Program and the IPCC and all of this, is as if this is what the oligarchs are fighting against rather than what they're secretly backing.
Well, it's funny because I remember when this kind of reminds me of Gerard Williams. He was the author of Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler. And when I first looked into his work, and I'm like, this makes perfect fucking sense. Like, there's no way he didn't have an escape plan. There's no way that he had all this shit thought out, but he didn't think about how am I going to get out of here. Like, really, he was advanced with propaganda. He was trying to find UFOs, reverse engineering, all this stuff. But yet he just said, hey, I don't have an escape plan. I'm just going to commit suicide. So I guess to connect that to what you're talking about is that it's similar to big oil. It's like to think that they haven't already thought about, okay, once oil isn't as needed as it has been, or as we transition into maybe electric cars, maybe they can't stop that movement, or maybe they're pushing that movement. Because I mean, as you know, and you talked about it in your first documentary about big oil, obviously they suppressed that technology initially, but now are they actually, pushing it?
Yes. It was just as I was working on this documentary this summer, I remember one of the big headlines, I think it was the Shell CEO. I can't remember which CEO, but one of the CEOs at one of the major oil companies came out and said, my next car is going to be an electric. And it was big news for a day or so. Yeah, they're absolutely pushing this. And look at their corporate PR propaganda. Look at anything that Shell or Exxon or any of these people are putting out right now. It's all about, how we're transitioning to post-carbon for the future and all of this. And they're absolutely behind it. And then the bigger picture, the smart grid and all of this other stuff that, again, is being done in the name of saving the environment is again, just total. It's 100% the technocratic dream coming into view. And it's the same interests. It's the same corporate interests behind it. But people are being tricked into thinking that going for that is somehow going against these same corporate interests that are literally creating and selling us this technology.
Well, one thing, what you initially, it's funny, Gerard Williams just sign on to Skype right now, and I was just talking about him. That's weird, but anyways, one thing that we're all parents, we all have kids roughly around the same age, and I've watched a lot of documentaries, a lot of stuff about eugenics, but as parents, I will say it's always looked at as this very negative light. And just to be a devil's advocate, we're all parents. When you hear stories about these really bad parents who do really bad things, who end up killing their newborn or leaving them in the car and they die, it does make you rethink eugenics a little bit. Like, maybe we should, filter out some of these shitheads and so, I mean, do you always see it as a negative thing, or have you even pondered on the fact that there is maybe some people that, and not fault of their own. I mean, they had bad parents. They had maybe they were exposed to chemicals and stuff. Because I always say, like, it's a vicious cycle. It's shitheads raising more shitheads, and then they raise more shitheads, and they raise more shitheads. And I think I'm quoting Pluto or Plato, but I say Pluto, yeah, and it probably would have made more sense than Plato, but it's easy to blame the person, the individual, but I think it's really important to understand that if we were them in their situation, we'd be them, and if they were us in our situation, most likely they'd be us, because we are creatures of our environment, and we're influenced by our environment. But so what's your thoughts on that? Have you ever thought about, like, eugenics in a positive light, or not, maybe that's the wrong way of putting it, but have you ever you know what I'm saying.
I get what you're saying. And there are several different issues there. One of which would be the eugenicists of our day and age would make the distinction, be careful to make the distinction between eugenics and dysgenics. See, dysgenics is that nasty stuff from a century ago where they were, sterilizing people against their will or euthanizing them, that kind of, we have to kill people to get them out of the gene pool. Eugenics is about making a better gene pool. It's about bettering the human race. So it's about encouraging people who are fit parents to breed, and encouraging people who aren't going to make such good parents, won't be able to provide a happy home life for their children, to use birth control, family planning. And of course, in that context, I mean, speaking personally as a voluntarist, if all of this is voluntary stuff, I mean, if people want to use birth control because they know they won't make great parents, yes, please, of course. I don't want people having children that don't want to have children. That's the worst possible outcome. The problem is when you start putting that into a third person perspective of, okay, so what can the state, what can outside society come in and tell people to do and not do? What can they enforce? And in what way can that be enforced? So who gets to decide who is fit to breed and who is not fit to breed? And in what process does that take place? Now, as you say, there are certain clear-cut cases where people should not be parents, people who end up starving, abusing, killing their children, whatever, these unimaginable, unthinkable, horrific things. And that does absolutely happen. That is a real problem. It is a real phenomenon that really does require solutions. But then is the solution to have some sort of government body determining these types of things? And well, you can't, I mean, I guess you can throw someone in jail after they kill their kid, but that seems not quite the right solution. So there has to be some sort of mechanism for surveillance and enforcement before they kill their kid, right? So maybe the government should have a way to monitor every single parent and how they're doing. Maybe there should be progress checks, and you should have state surveillance bodies that can come into your home. And, well, actually, you don't need physical people in your home. You might as well have cameras in your home at this point, because you can just then monitor everyone from some sort of central location. You don't even have to physically go there. And, well, if we're doing that, we might as well be monitoring for these other things, too. I mean, at what point does that stop? And who gets to decide that? And I think that's ultimately the point of this, because you raise the other important point of this, which is that if we are to say that a lot of what makes people into, fit parents or unfit parents, however we define that, is their circumstances, their experience, their economic circumstance, etc. If all of that goes into the shaping of what a human being is, then does that mean that person X, who is not fit to be a parent at this point in time, will never be fit to be a parent, can never be made to understand, to learn, to grow, to change? Do we want to sterilize people for the rest of their life because they're not capable of having children responsibly at this point in time? Again, those are the types of questions that come up with this. And again, I think fundamentally, the question of who gets to decide this, is it the people who are literally the ones that consider themselves genetically superior to you and me and everyone else who's listening to this conversation right now, because they have, 12 digits in their bank account or whatever, you know what I mean? They own the bank, more to the point. Do they get to decide who ultimately, is fit to survive or not? Because that is the ultimate ground level of that argument. When you are putting this into a third person body or perspective, what you are doing is you're saying, okay, the people who really control the system, they're the ones who get to decide who breeds and who doesn't. The other question to this is, well, how did people deal with this in human society, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, before the governmental social care institutions that we now take for granted? Oh, of course you have social care workers who are monitoring families and all of this. Well, those didn't exist 100, 200 years ago. They exist now because, to a large extent, of the eugenics philosophy and phenomena of the early 20th century. So what happened before that point? How did communities do things to look after new parents and see that they're raising their children? Can communities have more of a role to play in this than governmental bodies and things like that? So it's, again, I certainly see the point that you're making, that there certainly are people who really shouldn't be parents, and And what do we do about that? But I think, as always, the answer is not to put the power of that in some governmental body and then just say, okay, well, we're done. That's what we need to do. I think that the answer to that is going to be more multifaceted and going to involve people on a community level, which, of course, is one of the things that we have been deracinated from, to use a word. We've been unrooted from our sense of community in this process of urbanization and getting us into these boxes in apartment blocks in big crowded cities where we don't know our neighbors anymore. That itself is part of this whole agenda. As you see in my follow-up podcast on sustainable development, the idea is to round people up into these urban corridors where they're allowed to live to make space for nature, which is going to involve a lot of things like derooting people from their sense of community so that they're just isolated units in these big urban wilderness areas, as it were. And so it's part of a jointly locking social structure that's being locked into place. And there's not one answer to how to solve this problem without solving all the other problems that are linked to it.
Yeah, but there is a thing of negative eugenics and positive eugenics, right? Like, so the idea of, instead of killing a person, there's an incentive to maybe for somebody who is a better athlete, better looking, smarter, to have more kids. And it you look at, like, some people make the argument, well, there's incentives right now for the poor to have kids in America, the welfare state. We should have incentives to maybe not have kids, or incentives to, so there's probably a nonviolent way of getting people to, I guess, getting the people who you think, and again, this goes back to the issue, who decides who should be having children, who doesn't, and I think that is a huge issue. And I think another thing that you talked about, which I think is very important, is community. I grew up in a big family. I mean, I'm only one of two, because my parents were immigrants and came to America, and with trying to find work and shelter, being poor, you just didn't have the time or money to have a big family. But my dad was one of 12, my mom's one of 7, huge family. And they're poor. They were farmers. They grew up on a farm in northern Portugal. And I'm always like, well, how the hell did you do that? And it was because everybody was a part of raising the children. I remember growing up and talking to these old school Europeans, and they would talk about how, like, they were much more mature in their late teens, early 20s than we are today. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I got the internet. You don't know shit, But and then you realize what they meant was that, them in their teens, early 20s, were already taking care of their younger siblings. And so they really did understand, they could have children in their early 20s and get married in their early 20s and be much better prepared than a kid today, and everybody was a part of raising that children. Where today, like, which I think is a huge issue. I think it goes into why there's this epidemic of depression and anxiety, and why you see these tribes in the Amazon who don't have any signs of anxiety and depression. They all live in a community, and they're happy, and they don't need an iPhone, and they don't, because corporations and TV and marketing and the Edward Bernays techniques aren't convincing you that you're less if you don't have the new thing, and convincing you what you should be desiring. And so I think this is, this goes back to the bigger picture. And Rich, being a parent, what's your opinion on it? Do you have you ever pondered on the idea of, or how do you look at these? All
right. So first off, are you playing devil's advocate with the question, or do you understand an answer for yourself?
No, I definitely am playing a little devil's advocate. I think, but as a parent, emotionally, okay. I think when you hear these stories, emotionally, in some cases, your first reaction is those fucking, you just want to kill somebody.
But you're assuming that, okay, so first off, the people that they used to sterilize and try to keep from procreating, the low IQ people, they call them, those aren't the people muddying up the planet, poisoning the planet, enslaving the planet. Okay, so if there is a case to be made, it wouldn't be made against those low IQ people. It'd be made against average IQ people who don't think and take actions, and therefore take away the freedom of other people, right? And so what you're looking at with eugenics is a top-down phenomenon where you've got this group of people, and then they have like the Fabian socialists and other people like George Bernard Shaw, who had some very colorful ideas on eugenics and who should be allowed to procreate and who shouldn't. And it's good to familiarize yourself with those things. But as far as freedom goes, it's not my right to tell other people what to do, and it's kind of not their right to tell me what to do.
No,
as far as eugenics goes, positive or negative, if you give people the power and the technology to start messing around with the genome, which they already do, it's called CRISPR, that's not a good thing, because like anything else, they'll get their foot in the door and say it's good for human beings. Look at how they apply the technology overall with all this stuff. The smart grid, it's for your convenience, but it also serves a totalitarian tyranny purpose that happens to be very convenient right now to their plan, right? So every time they give us something like that and we think, oh, that's for us, no, what's the purpose of it? So eugenics, people see it growing up and they're like, family planning, that sounds smart. Well, learn the history behind all that stuff. I'm not saying don't participate in it. I'm just saying be knowledgeable about the institutions you do business with in this place.
Also, can I do a rider on that? Because you bring up the point of the people that they were sterilizing a century ago. Who did this actually apply to when they were, really pushing it out in the open? And yeah, I mean, low IQ. Really? Was that really who this was applied to? So sterilization, if you want to talk about it, let's look at the prime test case example that everyone knows, Carrie Buck, Buck v. Bell. Who was Carrie Buck? She was this girl who was growing up in a broken family, who ended up in this foster home, who ended up getting raped by I think it was the cousin or the nephew or something of that foster family, gets pregnant from the rape. And then as a result of that, is basically declared feeble-minded and sent off to this colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. She's not epileptic. She's not feeble-minded. Her daughter is declared feeble-minded just so that they can get that test case going. They can say, her mother was this prostitute because her father left her and, she was destitute. And then Carrie was, she was clearly feeble-minded because, look, she got pregnant as a teenager. Let's not count the fact that she was raped. And then this daughter, she must be feeble-minded too, because she had a look to her. There was something about her. I couldn't tell what the nurse actually declared in court. After a lot of prodding, by the way, she was initially hesitant to say anything, but then she said, "Well, there's something about the baby. I can't quite say what." That baby ended up being an exceptional student and, in fact, being on the honors roll in her class, but was still declared feeble-minded at the time. So these are the people that this is being applied to. The people who are downtrodden, the people who are victims, rape victims, whatever, the people who are perfectly fine, but they just need some reason to declare them feeble-minded. This is the way the power actually functions when you give it to someone. No matter what you think in your head, this might be good if we could just, if we use it the right way, if we use it the way I want to use this power. Always, 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 when you think about giving a power to some governmental body or something, think about the worst way that it can be abused, and then think, do you really want to give that power away?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I was being the devil's advocate a little bit. I think emotionally, I think you can get caught up in, hearing stories like that, seeing stories like that, and your first reaction, or at least my first reaction, is, you know what, maybe eugenics isn't the worst of ideas. And it is something that crosses your mind. But obviously, like you said,
that is a good process to argue through it in your head to come to a conclusion.
Yeah,
because if you don't, you're just like a believer, and that's no good. Like, ideology is not useful in freedom.
No,
unless ideology is, and common sense and reason is your ideology, because then you can embody freedom.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's very important to challenge. I mean, I don't know if you guys kept up with, I had a debate with Hunter Motz and Adam Kokesh on the show, and that's what it was about. It was about having two past guests that I enjoy, that I like, and are willing to. I picked them both because I knew they were both not just willing to share their ideas, but to have their own ideas challenged. And I think that's so important. I think, and James, you've talked about it on your show. It's like, don't just take my word for it. Don't just believe me, and go out, do your research. And I could be wrong, and I could be incorrect. And I think even on, I don't know if it was a Questions for Corbett podcast or whatnot, but I remember you talking about, times that when you were wrong and our ideas or beliefs that change. And they should. I mean, as new information comes in, we should constantly be changing. And I agree. Ideology is very dangerous. And I think a lot of what's going on now in the media, and I was talking to working construction, talking to a detail officer who was at Gitmo, and we're talking about, all this stuff about how, we got the police against the blacks, we got the conservatives against the liberals, we have, there's all this infighting. and then everybody's missing out on the big picture. And that's why this documentary is important, because while all of us are, getting mad at each other and arguing about transgenders and if there should be a third bathroom and all this stuff, and there's people are still, Lockheed Martin's still profiting, Halliburton's still profiting, everybody's still making money, and they're still pulling the strings. So I think it's really important to kind of stop and realize, like, all the people you're fighting with, a lot of times we're not that much different, and even with the last debate I was just referring to, it took me 20 minutes to get them to disagree, because they accidentally started agreeing right off the bat and just kept finding these things and I thought that was a good thing too, because it does show that for the most part we all want a safe environment. We want some way to make a living and get food and have a safe environment for our kids and some shelter, whatnot. And I think if we focus on those things, and unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, let me add to that, because you bring up the important point that we are the people that we're fighting with in these, whatever, left, right, black, white, gender, sex debates, whatever, all of this. Really, we are more like, because especially when you look at it through that lens of eugenics, where if the eugenicists have their way, you are equally as worthless, or maybe slightly less worthless than, this other person over here, but still the same level of worthless, where you're going to be eradicated from the gene pool. Everyone who's listening to this podcast right now is in that boat. The only people that they want is their family lines, their cronies, the very, very toppermost of the economic structure as it exists. That doesn't include you. That doesn't include me. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white or gay or straight or whatever. We're all in that same boat. And that's the perspective we need to have. It really is the 1% of the 1% of the 1% against the vast majority of humanity. And once we throw off the psychopathic parasites at the top, maybe then we can concentrate on all these other divisive wedge issues. Sure, let's go to town on that. But for the moment, maybe we can concentrate on the people who are actually trying to eradicate us from the gene pool. And I think they're starting to get some of that handle on that when you look at the declining sperm motility and all of that that's happening like an epidemic in the Western world, at any rate, the developed world right now.
Well, so, I mean, for example, to be the devil's advocate again, the poor in the U.S., one argument you hear a lot from people who aren't poor, middle class, upper middle class, whatever, that, they just keep having kids and they have incentive to keep having kids. So wouldn't that kind of go against the idea of having less of, the dumber, the less smart, the less capable? I mean, because they're reproducing at a faster rate than, because as people know, or at least they should, if you have a career, if you have hobbies and you do things you love, and you probably have less time to have kids. When you don't have opportunity, when you don't have a career, then you're more likely to have more kids. And so
you're describing the plot of Idiocracy by Mike Judge, right? Where Billy Bob is reproducing, and then the smart couple, they're too worried about the world to have kids.
Exactly.
Right? That's what you're describing.
Yeah.
Okay, so why is that a problem? It's only a problem because they're poor. Because if another family like a Rockefellers have, a whole bunch of kids, no one says anything about that because they have a bunch of money, right? So then what's it come down to? Education, opportunity? Well, we're all supposed to be guaranteed equal opportunity, not equal outcome. So the outcome comes from applying our knowledge and our skills and our experience in a praxeology type of manner. Like you take what you learn and you put it into action, right? So if the education system's not delivering to the people that are having a bunch of kids and happen to be poor, maybe they're poor because they're lacking in education, and that's by design. That's not really.
No, Rich, you don't get it. The
Rockefellers, and if they're getting supported, go ahead. Sorry.
The Rockefellers deserve their money because they're rich and successful. And why are they rich and successful? Because they deserve their money.
Right. There you go.
But
that's called a tautology, right?
Yes.
But
Yep.
Okay. So how is the question answered? So, but they still are. So if like you said, if the Rockefellers have a lot of kids, it's acceptable. If what they would consider the lower class people have a lot of kids. It's not acceptable, but yet
it comes down to how they spend their money, because the general tendency of poor people is they spend money on things that become liabilities, whereas the general tendency of rich people is they put their money into things that become assets. So really, then you get down to eugenics is based on how you make decisions about money in that case.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that then if you still, if one of the purposes is to have, to kind of, because you look at the history of the birth control clinic and all that stuff, you wanted the poor to have less children, and that is actually not happening. They're having more children. So what I'm saying is that by design? Is that accidental? Is that, I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Who is having more children?
Yeah, who's having more children? Dude, who are you talking about?
The poor in America. I mean, like we said, it's much more likely that somebody.
All right, there's no such thing as the poor in America. That's
okay. People in the welfare state. However you want to.
No, I'm just saying, like, groups don't exist, individuals exist. So you can talk about a specific case like a poor person or a hypothetical case of a poor person, but to generalize like the poor population in America, there's a lot of things going on. They could be veterans. The poor population in America, homeless people in America, right? There's a whole bunch of different things that go into that. So part of the internet thinking is people just like start to lump all that stuff together. And it's like, wait a minute, you're talking about a forest, but we're not talking about trees. You got to talk about trees that have a forest, right?
Yeah, I get it, but I'm saying in general, okay? I mean, so I go to the gym, I work construction. I'm constantly having conversations with people, and it's a common conversation that gets brought up, especially with Trump in office, and we're gonna get rid of this welfare state, and they keep having kids. We keep giving them incentives to have kids because of this or because of that. And like we talked about, it's when you have a career, when you have opportunity, you're more likely gonna maybe question if you should have kids, or if you have the time or effort, or the time or finances to have.
But that's
kids.
like saying the cart pushes the horse, right?
I'm not following you.
That's part of the problem. You're pushing the horse. Look, people in these situations, it's not necessarily their fault. Like if you're in a situation where you can't afford to have more kids,
you're talking about whose fault it is. Nobody's putting blame on anybody. All I'm saying is,
I'm just saying the causal part of the situation is when the government is handing out money to have kids, you might stop if you didn't have money or you didn't have a job, and you might say something, or because it's a religious thing, you can't do that. But in this other situation where for the past 60 years, money is just being doled out to everyone in your neighborhood. So there's like the causal is the money of the welfare state takes away people's ability to have upward mobility in life because they become comfortable on this thing that they don't have to work for.
The welfare state, part of what the welfare state is about is getting people rooted into government so that they become dependent and helpless in a lot of ways. But I think a lot of these conversations happen in an information vacuum where people are going on things that they know, they feel that they know, I've heard this many times, the welfare mom having 8 kids, being supported by the welfare state. So, this must be an epidemic problem because I heard it on Fox News. Well, what about the actual stats? This just out from a couple months ago, U.S. fertility rate reaches a record low. In 2016, the fertility rate in the United States was the lowest it has ever been. So, I mean, we can talk about this exploding problem of children being born, but it's not true. It's factually incorrect.
Well, if it's less now, it doesn't mean it's just less than what it was. It doesn't mean it's still not a lot, right?
Well, even the eugenics argument of overpopulation is based on Malthus, which has been disproved. I mean, one of the first places I saw a really good, interesting disapproval of it was by Buckminster Fuller. And he was kind of a globalist himself. Like, he was a really smart guy, and, he might have thought that globalism was the thing or whatever that was going to save us. I don't think he had the whole big picture. But as far as understanding overpopulation was a piece of propaganda that could easily be debunked. And even today, if you look at the stats of how many people in the world there are, it's like the problem isn't the world's too small. That's what they want us to think the problem is. The problem is resources are not going to be allocated according to equality or law or hard work or any of these things, because gangsters have run the world for a long time.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, you fly over any state, you're going to see miles and miles and acres of land that nobody lives in. So this idea that, you know, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough land for all of us to live. I mean, obviously people just go to the coast, and then you got overpopulation in like New York and LA and stuff like that. But there are plenty of places where people could live and start communities. The thing is that I guess that I'll put an end to this conversation, because I think that I don't know if maybe I'll have to re-listen to this to see if my question was actually answered. But the thing is, in America, okay, and it's not anybody's fault, but unfortunately, because of the shitty schools, this whole system, the whole shitty school system, because of our, we keep thinking like just putting money into schools and all this stuff, and we have to rethink that it's not school in general. You can't just throw money into it, because the way it's designed, the design sucks. So because of shitty schools, because of a lack of opportunity, because of suppression of certain minorities, okay, African Americans, Latinos, because of that, okay, and because the government, like James said, does want people to be dependent on the government, because that's how you get a Democrat or get people to vote Democrat. It's like, well, let's get you on the government tit, so then you keep voting for more government, okay? And so you've created a system where people are constantly, not wanting to end these things because people are benefiting from it. But at the end of the day, because of the lack of opportunity, because of poverty and all this stuff, you do end up having more kids. I know personally people who are in shitty situations, who end up having more kids because they're like, you know what, I can get a paycheck for it, and I just say I don't know who the father is, and I get a paycheck. So I'm not saying it's their fault. I think it's because of the situation that they're in. It's because of, one documentary that I'll bring up, because James suggested it a long time ago. I don't know when you talked about it, but Mafa 21 is a great documentary about also eugenics and also suppressing a certain type of people. And but my point is, so if we disagree, okay, on certain things, there does seem like when people who have less opportunity, less money, and have, I guess, more time to have kids, or because they do it because of the government check or whatever, then wouldn't that kind of go against the idea? Or is it they just, you're just ruling people? I guess it doesn't really does one, it almost seems like they're conflicting, the agenda of filtering them out, but also having more people who are on the government tit, right? So it's like, doesn't it seem like they're conflicting a little bit?
I see what you're saying. Again, I think the data actually disproves this. Again, fertility rate in America is at a record low. It has never been measured to be lower. So there are less children being born per 1,000 women in sub-30 age groups than has ever happened before in American history, as measured. So it is declining.
But who is?
Now, what you're talking about is the relative proportion of those being born to poor people as opposed to rich people. And I don't have the data on that. At any rate, as you say, there is the phenomenon of people who say, well, I can get a check, so I'll have another baby. That's a government incentive to have children in broken homes, generally, of single mothers or whatever, which is part of this deracination, the breaking apart of the family that I say is part of the larger eugenics agenda as well. The other part of the thinking that goes into this is what Brzezinski was saying, a decade ago. He was writing articles about it. He was giving speaking tours about it. He said over and over, it used to be easier to kill a million people than it used to be easier to control a million people than to kill a million people. It's now becoming easier to kill a million people than to control a million people. And what is the implication of that? It used to be fine even if the population is expanding, we've got them in our control. But they're starting to change. They're starting to get a bit uppity. It would be easier to kill off people at this point. And that's, I think, long term going forward, I think that's the strategy that's going to be. Already the population is increasing, but the rate of increase is decelerating, which means that the population is going to level out around 2050 to 2100 and then start declining, and declining pretty rapidly. Obviously in Japan, we see that right now. The population is actually shrinking now at this point, and it's only going to that decrease is going to increasing. The decrease is going to increase, if you get what I'm saying. And that's coming for the United States and everywhere else as well. In fact, would be happening right now if there wasn't immigration happening to the US and Canada and countries like that. So the decrease in population is already taking place in the developed world. In the developing world, it's the rates are coming down, but they're still much higher. So there's going to be more people being born in the developed world, where it is still probably easier to control 1 million people than to kill 1 million people. Well, actually, maybe that is about roughly equal. But at any rate, the control is certainly there, more so than it is, I would say, in, say, the United States, which from the eugenic perspective, the grand controllers of the eugenic agenda perspective, I think is what matters, is that they can see, oh, you know, we've got the population under control in every sense in the United States or whatever. In the developing world, yeah, that's going to continue to grow, but that might actually be part of the plan and might be part of the immigration warfare and other things that are taking place right now, the migration warfare in Europe and things like that. It's part of the plan to deracinate and to break apart family structures and to basically make sure that people don't have any defenses against this. So in the specific point that you're talking about, I think we agree that giving incentives for government incentives, welfare programs, are itself a bad thing, and in fact is aimed at breaking down family structures and communities and things like this that existed beforehand, before the government came along with the welfare state. These things were taken care of by communities, by churches, and however people congregated before in the pre-welfare state structures. And that's been, I think, methodically broken down since the New Deal and all of this came along. And I think that's part of the eugenical plan as well. Eugenics doesn't necessarily mean we're going to kill everyone. It just means we're going to control everyone. And in what sense are you going to control them? And that can be a depopulation. And I think depopulation is in the cards long term. But at the moment, I think it's more about making sure that everybody is dependent on government. Because once everyone is dependent on government, then the depopulation actually becomes so much easier.
Yeah, I guess that's where, and I completely agree with you. And I guess that's where internally I have this battle where it's like, okay, I get the depopulation thing, but yet I could almost see a agenda to have people beyond the government, to have more kids, or like you said, easier to control, easier to convince to buy shit, that they don't need with government money. So we're actually giving them the money to do this stuff. And it seems like that I could see that agenda too, where just, where if you can just create this giant herd of people who are not thinking for themselves and control them, then maybe depopulation isn't as necessary. But
and also, of course, we should also say that with every welfare structure system that comes into place, it's a way of guiding people into a certain choice. You can limit people's choices of what they can do with money in various ways. You can give them credits to get this or to do that, or you have to make them jump through this or that hoop in order to get this incentive. You have to vaccinate or whatever it is. So again, it's about increasing that control to the point where people aren't able to function as fully functioning independent human beings because they've been guided into this one channel, like cattle being guided down a channel into their eventual slaughter.
Now, do you think modern eugenics is? Do you think like you brought up vaccines? I mean, are they using techniques now to kind of continue similar type of strategy with vaccines or any other methods?
They certainly are, and Rich probably has a lot to say about that.
They don't even have to have an agenda, man. Corporations are allowed to run so fast and loose with things that get injected into your body and prevented from being sued by the government with the Vaccine Protection Fund and that whole secret slush fund that they just pay people off and then you sign a paper and you can't. So there's this whole thing where there could be an agenda, but it's not even necessary for the corporations to act as they do, which is very not protective of your health and very protective of their patents and their profits and protecting themselves from any damage that they do to other people. That wouldn't go as human to human, but when it's a corporation with the rights as a human being, it becomes a whole different thing. And when it partners with government, then you got a whole different monster that you're looking at there. But what they're because you had the question before, and I think you were noticing a contradiction, and I think that contradiction, if I could summarize it, is these eugenicists are population control, but then they also provide the welfare state and have all these people having a bunch of kids. Okay, that seems like a contradiction, so let me see if I can help you resolve that. The more people that are on welfare and having kids, that's growing their subscribers. Government is growing their subscribers. Those people are going to be on welfare generation after generation. Most likely, they're going to be helpless to get away from the state. The other people who might resist, here's Planned Parenthood, here's birth control, here's, accidental sterilization from food chemicals you might come into contact with, or all this other stuff in the environment that they put out there. So what you have to do is step back and look at the agenda overall of what these people have done over a couple hundred years. They are seeking biological control over every plant, animal, and human being on this planet. That, by definition, is a violation of your freedom, because these other people are seeking to control your biology without your free will being involved, without your volition being involved, right? So what James was saying about, like, in the 1900s, churches and private charities would take care of all this stuff. Government came in and said, you don't know how to spend your money well enough. We're going to spend the money on your behalf. And oh, by the way, all these welfare programs, it's one thing for government to give people, something to help them out. It's another thing to steal from people and then have the government hand that out, because that's what the taxation is. That's what the government's saying when, you don't know how to spend your money well enough, as good as they do, right? So this whole idea becomes untangled when you start to pull at the individual threads of what is the welfare state, what are the poor in this country, the people that are on welfare generation to generation to generation. That's a group of people being taken advantage of, who, if they had other tools and skills at their beck and call, would not be in that situation. So it's only by depriving them of the education that would allow them to gain knowledge, practice that knowledge, gain experience, and thrive in the world, that they can be in that situation where they have to look to the government to solve their problems, right? So there's a whole lot there. But the point is, to resolve that contradiction, it benefits the people in power to grow their population weak and to keep the people who are strong from doing any sort of procreation on their own.
Can I add some bones to that meat, Rich?
Absolutely. I wish you would.
Because you say that it doesn't necessarily have to be an agenda, and I think you're right about that, but it is an agenda, and we don't have to speculate about that. We know the agenda. It is written. It is documented. And in Why Big Oil Conquered the World, you mention in one of the clips that I include you in, you mentioned the crypto eugenics. It's going by different names these days, and you mentioned molecular biology, and there's this book, The Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay, talking about how the Rockefeller Foundation, Caltech, gave rise to the new biology, molecular biology, the idea that life can be reduced to molecules that can then be manipulated, and that's the way we understand what life is and how it arises, which of course is finally being challenged by all sorts of different things that are going on right now in studies into epigenetics and things that are changing our conception of what life is and how it's structured. But this has been the founding ideology of 20th century work in those fields. And to what end? Again, we don't have to speculate. In the 1968 annual report of the Rockefeller Foundation, they had they explicitly acknowledged funding the development of anti-fertility vaccines and trying to implement that on a mass scale. So you can go and read that yearly report where they're talking about drugs known to diminish male fertility, but those that have been tested have serious problems of toxicity. Very little work is in progress on immunological methods, i.e. vaccines, to reduce fertility, and much more research if a solution is to be found there. So they started directing their resources into that. And lo and behold, 4 years later, after the Rockefeller Foundation launched their big anti-fertility vaccine push, the United Nations, under the auspices of the World Health Organization, launched the Task Force on Vaccines for Fertility Regulation, which was all about taking up that mantle from the Rockefeller Foundation and developing these vaccines. And then you start to get the reports from the 1990s, reports from the 2000s, about these various populations that are getting these vaccines through UN-mandated programs. Oh, it's all to save the tetanus shot shots and things. Oh, it's just, to help the population, but they're giving them specifically to childbearing age women. Why men can't get tetanus? What's going on here? So when they test the drugs, they find this abortifacient in it called HCG, which causes spontaneous abortions in women, in some cases for years after the vaccine is delivered. What's going on? Oh, it was a tainted oh, sorry about that. Oh, we didn't mean to put that abortifacient in your vaccine. There is a coordinated agenda. It has been openly talked about and written about in annual reports for decades. It does involve things like vaccines, which will be one factor, one variant of ways that they can implement that agenda. And it's about controlling life at the molecular level, because that's the way in the eugenicist mindset that life is structured. Now, they're wrong about that, and increasingly proven to be wrong about that, but there is elements of truth to that. And if they can manipulate life on a molecular or genetic level, they certainly will. And that's, I think, part of the long-term goal that they're striving for. And again, we don't have to speculate about it. There's plenty of documentation of this in all sorts of different places.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the amazing thing about your documentary is that the articles, the books, the quotes that you find, that it's not a secret. It's out there. The information's out there. Just a matter of having somebody like yourself doing the research and giving up any personal time or life to do this research. I'm kidding, obviously, but I'm sure it does take up a lot of your time. I mean, I was telling Rich before we did the show, I'm like, James is probably one of the nicest guys to or in regards to coming on people's podcasts and giving them a little bit of his time. And then he still does like multiple videos sometimes a week and documentaries and all that stuff. So it's to go back what I was saying, it absolutely is amazing when you're like, holy shit, like they're talking about this stuff. It's out there. It's open. It's not a secret. It's not, but it's the path that we're leading. And because the thing is, all our children are going to be growing up in a world that's much different than the world we grew up in. And we grew up in a world where like there's a such thing as privacy, and we kind of probably in between, like, okay, we kind of grew up without the internet, and now we kind of have the tool and we can use it, and it hasn't consumed our lives. The way today a kid grows up, they never know a world without social media. They don't know what a pound symbol is. They only know hashtag. It's like it's amazing the world that they're growing up in. But they all, to get to my point, but they're also growing up in a world where privacy is a thing of the past. But it's not abnormal to them. It's completely normal to them because that's the world they grew up in. This is the norm.
How did they get us to give up our privacy, Ricky?
How did they get us to give up our privacy?
Like if you brought Ben Franklin and these guys up from the past, and they're like, "Whoa, you guys lost your privacy. How'd that happen?" What's your excuse? What do you tell these guys?
I think the common person would say, well, I don't feel like I'm giving up anything because I'm just using Instagram and just using Facebook, and it's no big deal, and I'm getting some type of enjoyment out of these social medias and connecting with people. So the little bit of privacy that is lost, to me, maybe is worth it. And I think
I'm interested to hear Rich's take on this, but let me give my own crack at it, because I think you're exactly right about that, Ricky. It's our human tendency is we are social animals. Absolutely. We're social people. We want to be in social community with other people. And increasingly that is facilitated through online transactions. So we are, from the average user's perspective, when I go on Facebook, I'm not going on I'm not connecting to some server in Silicon Valley. I'm connecting with my friends. It's about sharing information with my friends. I'd be happy to share my photos or whatever with my friends, of course. I do that in real life. Why wouldn't I do it online? Because people have been trained to think this is you connecting to your friends, not you connecting through a third-party service with your friends. So I think it's a trick of our psychology to a certain extent, the fact that we do want connection with other human beings. And we've been tricked into thinking, well, this is it. This is how you connect with other people. It's through this technology. And who's the middleman? Oh, don't think about that. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. Well,
for my 2 cents on it, people have always had to compromise their security to have social relationships, right? So that's pre-internet era that goes back thousands of years, right? You're not having much of a social interaction if you're wearing a mask and using a false name. You know what I'm saying? So you've always had to, like even sending a letter, you got to write your name on the outside. They know, So there's all these compromises in privacy for social interaction, traditionally in human nature. The issue is now they're pressing record, and it's like, look, here's the Patriot Act that says the government can now, because it's one thing to share with all these disparate companies, but the government comes along and says, we're going to take all that data and put it into a big model, not to keep you safe, not to protect your rights, right? So that's the issue that I think is off everyone's radar, is that since 9/11 and since the Patriot Act, the government has had unprecedented access to not only surveil actively hundreds of millions of people, but to use their tax dollars to build centers like that place in Utah that's going to hold it for the next 100 years or so, right? That's the issue with compromising privacy these days in this market, and the fact that all these portals for social media share so readily, so like almost like they were government projects in the first place to get that data. I don't know.
No, I completely agree, and I think you're right. But I think, unfortunately, kids, whatever they're raised in, that is the norm. Like we were raised where male, physical male was, it was a big deal. Like nobody opens your mail, nobody goes in your mailbox. I mean, there's laws against going in somebody's mailbox, but yet it's completely okay for the NSA to read all your emails, look at all your dick pics, do all that stuff. And sorry guys, I just have to throw a joke in there every once in a while. And James like, oh, I thought you were being serious.
Yeah.
Well, you are. I mean, we've had. I can't remember when it was, but there was some NSA agent saying, "Yeah, we look at your dick pic." I remember hearing that once.
And so I think it's scary because. And I think there's a great short video called "Free Isn't Free" or something along those lines, talking about how when you get a Google phone, when you get when you use Google, you think like, oh, this is awesome because this service is free, but you're giving up so much. You're giving up your information. You're giving up. I mean, everybody's become a statistic. Everything. It's all like, oh, well, this person is looking at cars, so let me send this information to the car dealership, and so they can give them advertisements and stuff like that. And I mean, I'm sure you guys both know, and I don't know if the listeners know, but all the research with Facebook, knowing when somebody is gonna get married or break up or come out of the closet, or all these things that they can figure out before you go public with any of this stuff. They can already figure out where your life is leading by just analyzing who you're hanging out with, where you're hanging out with, and all this stuff. And I think that's really scary. But I think, unfortunately, our kids are going to grow up in a world where it's almost like driving. I love driving. I've always been a car guy. But my kid's going to, by the time he's old enough to drive, or what, if that changes, who knows what the age. But if it's still 16, he's going to probably grow up in a world where they have self-driving cars, and he'll be like, "Dad, what the hell is a big deal about driving? Why do you miss it? Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to, But to him, because he never had that pleasure, he didn't grow up with, having that freedom of like just hopping in a car and going wherever you want. To him, it's not going to be a big deal. So it almost seems like the trend is going in that direction. And as every new generation of kids who grow up in this world, this becomes the norm. And then it just it continues.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I've actually had that conscious thought a lot recently. And I think one of the things that I am doing with my work, if nothing else, is to show to future generations, like my children and their children, there were people who lived a different way than this. What you are living, what you think is normal, is not necessarily normal. And there were people who were looking at the future that you are now living in and seeing that as a nightmare. That should give people pause for thought. And in the exact same way that when we go back and read 1984 and realize that the things that are happening right now were the nightmare totalitarian society of the past. People were, it was so incomprehensible they had to put it in strange science fiction fantasy novel, universes, because the idea this would ever happen in the USA or in Britain or at places like this, it's just silly. That's just sci-fi fantasy nonsense. People were screaming about this a generation or two ago, and here it is. Ray
Bradbury wrote about it like that was his greatest fear, and now you basically have libraries doing the book burning by just throwing the books away. They don't even need firemen like in the book. Yep. And you've got everyone with their telescreens and their reality TV show. I mean, I remember reading the book, but I also remember watching the movie and how trippy it was to watch these people interact with their fake TV screens, and I was a little kid. And now that's what goes on.
That's what it does, yeah. Let me just back up a second, because I want to kick back against something that Richard glossed over when he was talking earlier about the fact that, you know, the privacy invasion is happening through government. Richard sort of glossed over the corporate side of it. Well, it's one thing to give your information to corporations, but the government is sitting. But I think that's another extremely important part of this that we shouldn't gloss over, because even just giving it to corporations is a huge part of this puzzle. Go back to my episode 319 on Psychographics 101, where I talk about Cambridge Analytica, which is a private company that has all these connections to government, and it services government, and it, you know, contracts its services to government. But it's a private company that has myriad ways of collecting whatever they say. I can't remember. They bragged 2,000 different data points or whatever on every single adult person in the United States. Just an unbelievable thing. And from that, they are constructing psychological profiles and all of this so that they can individually tailor advertising to you. And to whatever extent all of this is hype at the moment, at any rate, that is the thing that's coming into view. You look at companies like Axiom and these other things that no one's ever heard of that are collecting every single piece of data that you give out there to all of these different corporations that are, of course, happy to sell it on to third parties, that then construct these detailed profiles of you that in some cases probably know you better than you know yourself. And that is, I mean, let's not gloss over that. Even without the government side of it, that is a problem. And we need to be aware of that. And we need to be more aware of the ways that we're giving up our personal information to these corporate behemoths that have no scruples about using that in various ways, including contracting those services to government.
I absolutely agree. Thank you for helping me out with that, James. I did not mean to intentionally gloss.
I
did not think you did, but I wanted to add some drama to the conversation.
That's great.
No, yeah.
Very useful.
So it seems pretty, like, the future seems pretty scary. Like, how do we put the brakes on? Because it seems like as every generation, I mean, generations before us were saying the same thing, right? Now we have TV, and now we have, you know, and it's like we survived. I mean, could you make the case that some way that things seem really scary but maybe we'll just all accept one day? I mean, Joe Rogan's talked about this, how he sees the future of being one day nobody will have privacy, and that's just the world we live in. And he doesn't talk about it in a negative light. He almost says it like, well, it won't be the worst thing
That's because he hasn't thought it through, man. When you don't have privacy, that means the drones that can fly 24/7 now because they're solar powered can find you anytime. So the government then has a sort of Damocles over, and it's not even just a national government. We're talking a global government, because if you want to go with their ideas unrestrained and unresisted, that's what they want. They want a globalist agenda with a global lockdown, using robots and drones to just track all the human resources on the planet and dispose of them at will, and nobody will be able to do anything about it. And it extinguishes freedom forever. You know how long it took freedom to emerge on this planet? It's only been around for a couple hundred years, and it was in an imperfect form. But these other people who convince you, oh, collectivism's cool and all this stuff, drones, technocracy, CERN, all this stuff, they have a surprise waiting at the end of the tunnel for everybody. And I'm saying there are other exits out of this mountain right now. That's all I'm saying.
Such as?
Yeah,
I think that's the point.
So it all depends. It all depends on intellectuals not having individuals not having intellectual self-defense, right? So they depend on a public that's easily malleable and believes their propaganda. So the most effective way is to give individuals the ability to self-learn their way out of it. And you do that by collecting all this data that we find around us and making media out of it. And people who are, how do you say, autodidactic, self-learning, are the early adopters picking up this new technology that we're trying to spread around, called some sort of truth that's reflective of objective reality, because we're not getting it through schools. We're not getting it through our media. And that's how we've gotten as far as we have as civilization, because they've kind of, since World War II, pacified everybody with all this amazing technology and all this media and stuff like that, right? They've really taken a good, strong hold on it. But I also think that people are realizing now that college educations don't guarantee you a job, and even a job doesn't guarantee you a prosperous life, and that the tools of self-reliance that once made people come all over the world to America, that whole lifestyle is gone for the most part. So as individuals recognize that, they can broaden their shoulders and learn to bear the weight and responsibility of freedom, because there are responsibilities that come along with this situation. And there's a good reason that freedom never existed in history, because people were controlled through a whole bunch of painful methods. And when you're in pain or you're starving or you're being held as a slave, it's very hard to reason your way through. And that's why you don't see freedom and Montesquieu and all these ideas until after the Renaissance, because before then, people were just subsisting from day to day to day and hoping not to get killed by the king. So it took a long time for freedom to start to emerge. It's not perfect yet, but I think it needs more work, definitely, if it wants to hang out. And that work needs to be done now and not later.
Can't you make the argument that some people want to be
based on what we've been talking about, I mean, let's just give the benefit of the doubt. We're all independent thinkers here who have some degree of cognitive liberty and critical thinking. But there are different strategies for dealing with these problems, because one of the fundamental problems we're talking about here is the technology itself enables these new forms of human interaction and relation that we don't have the biological defenses against. I mean, we may be, whatever your beliefs are, whatever, we're evolved, or we as human beings have the sort of know-how to deal with people in social situations where it's actual human interaction. But these interactions through technological media is something that's alien to our human nature, and thus can be easily exploited or manipulated without us even really understanding it. So the question is one of strategy. How do we deal with that? Do we go with technological Luddism and reject all of this technology, or do we try to steer it into something, using an open source revolution to try to steer this technology towards the good? But can that be played on behind the scenes to steer us, into ways that we're not intending to go, et cetera? I mean, there's some real strategic issues here that I think we need to tackle, and I don't have any clear answer to that. I don't have a definitive answer anyway, because we can talk about rejecting all technology and whatever, but obviously anyone who's listening to this conversation isn't. So we're all making some sort of compromise. Hey, we're talking on Skype right now, owned by Microsoft. I mean, come on. We are playing into the system to some extent. And yes, it's to try to get this information out to others. And so you got to play with the tools that you have. But then, well, we should also be advocating the ways to steer this technology in a good direction, right? Well, what does that look like? I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this and strategic decision making that has to go on that I really think we need to be talking about in greater detail. Not us specifically, but I think just generally speaking, the independent, liberty-minded people.
Well, I also think that morally and ethically, my only responsibility is to deal with my personal situation and not try to come up with answers for other people, right?
Exactly true. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We don't need a one-size-fits-all solution. That's true.
Yeah.
We just need to not be ignorant of the situation we're in. That's all.
Well, I think you bringing up the technology thing is really important, because I think we can all sound very anti-technology, and I don't think we can. It's not the fault of the technology, it's the way it's being used. Obviously, in some cases, like we're using right now, it's very beneficial and it can be used in a very positive way. Unfortunately, people, we like Rich said, we always end up sacrificing some privacy for these social conversations. And I just think that obviously to the extent that we're sacrificing, most people, the average person doesn't realize maybe how much they're sacrificing. And even if they do, I think it's getting to the point where it's become completely acceptable. Edward Snowden, when he first talked, when he went public with his story and whatnot, people were just like, "Oh my God!" Well, obviously not us, but people, the average person, the average person was like, "Oh my God!" But that went away, and that's what's scary. It went
Remember
away.
when total surveillance was a conspiracy theory?
Exactly.
I remember.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that keeps scaring me, is the fact that it becomes how do you stop a 16-year-old who is going to be the future and going to outlive us probably, and how do you stop their generation of saying, well, who gives a shit? I'm completely okay with this. This is the world I grew up in. I'm okay with it. I don't see anything wrong with it. And it is very, we're all going to sound like old geezers saying that, your music sucks and look, and we grew up in a better generation, and we, our lifestyle and the way we lived was, I guess, more normal or whatever. But that's the thing, like, what is normal? And how do we know if we're not just
Hey, when I was growing up, I used to make fun of my dad. He didn't ever want to use a bank card. He would never use a cell phone. I was like, you old geezer. We all live long enough to learn better about what we should have understood. Learn from your parents rather than mock them. But anyway, yeah, my children are going to go through that too, huh?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It is. I mean, I think that's the scariest part, is that how do you pump the brakes? How do you get people to and I think there's me and Rich and I are cigar smokers, and one thing that I've talked a lot about is the reason why I think cigars and whiskey, and you're seeing things like that becoming more popular. And I feel like the further we get away from that type of lifestyle where we enjoyed smells and tastes and like those senses that we neglect so much today. I mean, a kid today, their enjoyment, it comes from their phone or Netflix or whatever, where for not thousands, but for many generations before that, the enjoyment was sitting down with family, socializing over dinner and maybe some wine or whatever, and so that's what people use for enjoyment. It was that social thing, like growing up. If I had to F my report card, it was a big deal. But if I missed dinner, it was the biggest deal, because it was when the family was together and when we talked and we enjoyed mom's cooking. And and I think that.
Remember when you were out for a meal with your friends or whatever, and you actually talked to your friends? Everyone was concentrating on the conversation rather than their device.
Which is one reason why I love podcasts, because my phone's on airplane mode. I look at it every once in a while. If I write, sometimes I write notes in it and that are useful for the podcast. And it's very rarely do you have this conversation without distractions. And I think the more we're distracted and the more I think there's a sense of therapy you get from sitting around and having a nice meal or having a cigar or whiskeys. I mean, in America, breweries or IPAs or companies are popping up everywhere, because I think people are enjoying the social atmosphere of it. Because there is something missing. I mean, as much as I love talking to James and Rich via Skype, there's something missing through this that you don't get in person. It's more casual. There's a connection that you just cannot get through technology, through Skype.
So when are you guys coming to Japan?
I'd love to, actually.
Yeah. Well, are we going to have this conversation in real life someday? I hope.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I mean, luckily Rich lives, when me and Rich connected for the first time, I found out that he lived in Hartford, and which isn't that far from me. It's about 35 minutes. So we connected a few times, and again, same thing. Like, once you're in person, it's just a whole different type of conversation. So there is something. So do you think that part of us, because that's, talking about us being social creatures, that's one thing that it's like, as much as technology has changed and we're adaptive creatures, one thing that seems to stay true regardless is that we need interaction, we need community, we need these things. And I think that might be maybe a little bit of hope, the fact that no matter how good technology is, there's still, and then we can get to the point where can we make the argument that technology can get so good where you don't know the difference between reality and virtual reality.
Well, if you want to crush any hope from this conversation, even disregarding all of that, eventually, if what we're talking about is this super engineered super class of super eugenicists who will rule over everything, at some point the calculus really becomes, do they need the rest of humanity at all? Will the drones and the robots, rather than controlling the rest of humanity, won't they just replace the rest of humanity? And I think that's a genuine, real question that we're going to be confronting in the not so distant future. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but it's coming. And that has a very, very, very bleak outcome if we allow things to get that far.
Of course, on the other hand, that could be all a simulation. And if it was a simulation, you have to ask the question, what's the purpose of the simulation? And I would say there's a really, really cool place, and they don't want any douchebags getting in. And therefore, we all go through this test we call life and do our learning and then, check that out. Oh, wait, I guess somebody already made a story out of that. That's a thing. So scratch that idea and, just imagine something cool.
So what does it say about me that I think that the real ending to the Matrix trilogy should have been that Neo, well, maybe Neo doesn't discover, but you discover that Neo was just playing a different level of the Matrix. It's just all part of the Matrix where he thinks he has escaped the Matrix.
It's all turtles. It's turtles all the way down, James.
Yeah.
You got the answer. That's it right there. Are you familiar with that, Ricky? The idea, the Hindu belief, turtles all the way down.
But share it, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who isn't
familiar with it. The notion was that the Earth rides on the back of a turtle, and then when you ask what holds a turtle up, it's turtles all the way down.
The turtle's on a turtle, and that turtle's on a turtle, and that turtle's on.
And there's a cool country song called "Turtles All the Way Down."
First of all, that's not true. There is no such thing as a cool country song.
Actually, it's a psychedelic country song, and that might be what makes it cool. You should check it out.
Were you doing edibles when you listen to it? Because that might change the way it sounds, maybe a little bit.
Absolutely not. No.
But thanks, guys. So is there any? Obviously, you're a fan of James's, just like I am, and I'm sure you're familiar with this documentary because you were a part of it. Is there any question before we put an end to this podcast? Is there any question from your perspective that you'd like to ask James? Maybe watching the documentary that came to mind.
When's part 3 coming out? Okay, so
there's no plan for part 3.
CorbettReport.com/big oil. There's part 1, there's part 2, and maybe if you guys are good in the future, James will do a part 3 for you. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't think I'll call it part 3, but I think the rest of my work is in some ways a part 3. But my question for Rich is, when is the Rothschild book coming out?
Ooh, never ask a writer when the book's coming out. Okay, so I've worked like the past 8 weeks till the wee hours of the morning, adding all this juicy content to the book. The book is getting huge. I did the bibliography and the table of contents. Those things are very descriptive and huge, unfortunately. So the book keeps getting bigger, but the whole book is footnoted. Every statement, every declarative sentence is footnoted somehow. So I wrote a book to try to teach people how to learn through this process, as opposed to how most books are just written to tell you a story. I'm telling you a story with a high degree of fact that's going to be very interesting. It spans about 150 years, so the fact that it might take me a couple more months to get it finished, no big deal. And
I don't mind when it comes out, as long as it comes out. I'm just waiting.
It might even be 2 volumes.
Wow.
So I'm switching the limit of the format right now.
Wow.
That's one thing I love about doing this podcast is I've had the pleasure of meeting 2 guys like you guys. I mean, two amazing researchers, and I mean, the Peace Revolution podcast is fucking crazy. I mean, I don't know how you do it, like that many hours of clips. And I mean, I'm just surprised that when I met you in person, you didn't have bags under your eyes, and I see you doing speed and just drinking fucking.
Because I'm always chasing after James. I'm trying to always keep up with him. That's how it looks like I'm going so fast.
Yeah, you just put clips together. I put podcasts together. It's different.
yeah, it's just different.
It is.
Yeah, there's a lot of source material to that stuff, but the strategic way, once you know how to create something, is when you find something cool, you make some notes about where the coolness was in that piece of media, and then you organize pieces of media that have similar content into folders, and you let them mature, marinate, if you will, until they have enough flavor in them, and then you set it free.
That's the real secret to doing this. Anyone out there can do it. Just when you're listening to all this stuff that you like to listen to, just make notes of all the juicy bits. And eventually you'll be like, oh, I can take this bit here, this bit there, this bit there, this bit. Wow, that makes a story.
Right. It's just a practice of learning. It's like taking what you learned and having a practical application of it where you can put it to use for other people.
Well, people are doing that even with the Rogan podcast and many other podcasts. I've even told my listeners to maybe help me out and possibly do it in the near future, is taking these parts of these conversations that I don't sound quite as dumb, and or just when a guest on the show says something that's really, it sticks with you, because sometimes in a conversation they'll say something like, what, that really resonated with me. Like, take those clips and then
find those nuggets, cut them out, share them with the creator, and share them on social network.
Because we're talking about kids today. I mean, kids today just aren't gonna. Not all of them. I mean, many of them will, but there's many kids who won't listen to a whole 2-hour podcast. But they might get their attention with a maybe 2-minute clip or a 1 minute. I mean, you're doing it now with your documentary. These short little clips talking about each part, and I think that's great, because if you haven't watched a documentary yet, you can kind of get these clips, kind of get a feel what the the documentary's about.
Look, I'm acutely aware that a 2-hour documentary doesn't fly in the same way it did even a few years ago. People really are not putting that much time into it these days.
Well,
attention spans are getting shorter, Ricky.
Well,
you got to do something,
James, because your most famous video till this day is one of the shortest videos you've ever done, the 9/11 conspiracy theory. So, I mean, that's a perfect example. And I remember even myself, it was easy to share. It was more likely they're going to watch it because they were like, oh, it's only 5 minutes or whatever, then I'll watch it, instead of sending them hours and hours of documentaries that they'll never get around to. So I think it is beneficial, and I think all our fans, if anybody wants to do that, I think we're all more than happy to, not to speak for you guys, but more than happy.
My work is totally open for remixing and reposting and doing whatever you need to do to it, just to get the information out. That's the most important part of it.
Yeah, same thing with mine. I always say the same thing that mine, and actually I got that from you, James, because I thought it was such a great idea, this open source thing. So I always tell all my guests and stuff, I'm like, listen, put it anywhere, paste it anywhere. I don't care. Sharing the conversation is much more important than trying to get, attention on myself or the podcast. So, but so that was your question, right? That was, you both shared a question. So
I think so.
Part 3, you'll be Don't Hold Your Breath, and the book might come sooner than part 3 of that documentary. So
that's right.
But so thanks again, guys. We all have families, and we all want to make sure our wives don't kill us. So I won't hold, as tough as we sound and as smart as we sound, our wives don't care. So they always kind of put you back to reality if you're ever like, oh, look, I'm doing something and I'm important, and I'm sure, and then they're like, oh, I don't care, just dinner's ready, just hurry the fuck up, so
take out the garbage.
Exactly. Yeah, which I did right before this podcast. So we are, it's even
that's
though
how he was allowed the podcast.
exactly. I'll give you an extra 20 minutes if you take out the trash.
There you go.
So but thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it. I can't thank you guys enough for being on. I've been a huge fan of both of you guys for a long time, as you know, because James was one of my first guests, and Rich was supposed to be one of my first guests, but I think I only had him on a year or two later because of just back and forth, and I think you were moving and all that stuff. But I can't thank you guys enough. People, if you're not familiar with Rich's work, Rich, let them know where you can get all your work.
You go to tragedyandhope.com. It's named after a history book, and there's a historical podcast where you can trace the evolution and lineage of a bunch of different ideas that relate to freedom.
And James, the CorbettReport.com, of course.
CorbettReport.com, and if you want the documentary specifically, it's CorbettReport.com/Big Oil, and that has both how and why big oil conquered the world, video formats, audio, complete hyperlinked transcripts, which I think are particularly important for people who care about the research. Anything you hear in that documentary, you'll find it in the transcript along with the link to go to the source documents. So, it's a hell of a lot of work to put that together. I hope people use it as a resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Hopefully you're not like that Ricky and that eugenics conversation was ridiculous. But being the devil's advocate,
it's important to talk about.
I think it is.
It's very important.
Yeah, I think it is important because people do have those type of ideas and that type of thinking, and we need to acknowledge it and really see. I was again curious to see the perspectives from from Rich's and James's, and I think it's you need to do that. You need to challenge your own ideas and wonder why you believe certain things. So thanks again, and hopefully we do this again because I love doing this roundtable type of thing. It's a blast, and I think that it's always awesome when we get fans that will kind of intertwine and maybe we expose everybody to these really interesting podcasts. So. For the 8th millionth time, thanks again, guys, and I'll keep in touch, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you, Ricky. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Ricky.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, James. Take care.
Believe in the ripple effect.